Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here and joining us to talk about the true cost of grants and how you maximize the recovery of those costs with your grants. Awesome. So my name is Kathleen Kizior, and I'm an advisory senior associate with Cherry Bekaert. I'm going to be kicking off this presentation and talking about the true cost of grants. And after me will be Nicky Lettini, and she is an advisory director with Cherry Bekaert, and she is going to dive into all things indirect costs and cost recovery. So again, we'll start with true cost of grants. Also, this is going to be a fairly quick overview. So please post any kind of questions you may have in the Q&A, and hopefully we can get to them at the end of the session. And then Nicky will come in and talk about maximizing your cost recovery. And then hopefully we have some time for a Q&A and we can go through some of your questions. So let's talk about what a grant actually costs you. How do you recognize those invisible costs that you might have, will probably incur because you're going to get a grant, right? So let's talk about what actually is an invisible cost. So invisible cost can also be called an embedded cost. It can also be called a hidden cost. And these are costs that are associated with your grant that you may or may not have expected. It's a cost that's necessary for your grant compliance and regulations. And it's a cost that you really are going to have to incur to sustain your grant funding. You know your direct costs. You know your direct costs that are directly associated with the grant or things like the salaries of the folks working directly with the grant or program costs. But what we are going to dig into today is how can you actually know what that grant is going to cost you. It's not just going to be these direct costs, there will be other costs involved as well. So your knowledge of these hidden costs or invisible costs can help you understand how to sustain your grant. And even if you can sustain that grant, what is this going to cost you to implement it? How can you follow these requirements? Do you have the funding and all these other aspects of costs that may or may prevent you from actually complying with your grant requirements? So no matter what type of organization that you are in, whether it's large, whether it's a small organization, whether you're in a government or a nonprofit or some other type of organization, these invisible costs apply to you if you are looking at actually acquiring a grant. No one is exempt. So what we want to do today is we want to take these invisible costs and make them visible to you so you can prepare for those before or even during a grant. The best analogy I could think of was Wonder Woman in her invisible jet flying up in the sky. You know, it's there, right? But we can't see it. So when she lands and she takes her magic off of that jet and it's not invisible anymore, it's like, oh no, wait, what is this? She actually has the jet. Those costs are actually there. So the first thing we're going to look at is the cost of a grant life cycle. Next one, please. So we have this in three parts. First of all, you have your pre-award grant readiness costs. So these are all your costs that you're going to incur in your grant, like before you even get your grant, when you're looking at your grant, before you apply, we have these pre-award costs that are definitely or may be incurred that is going to affect your ability to actually comply with the grant. Then you've got your post-award grant compliance and your operational costs that you have to comply with during the time of the grant. So these costs are, you know, things maybe you didn't think about before, but now they're incurred now in that post-award phase. And then our last phase we're looking at here at the bottom is our organizational indirect costs, which Nicky's going to dig into for you and talk to you about. And also there's grant technology solutions and other organizational costs that you may not have realized that are there that are going to affect your ability to actually meet the requirements of your grant. Next slide, please. So the invisible costs for pre-award readiness. These are our costs that we haven't got the award. Maybe we haven't even thought about, much more than I think I want to apply for this award. I think we want this. What are the costs that we normally don't see that we are definitely going, or we may incur as we're doing this? So the first one is costs of submitting bids, proposals, and applications. Right here, maybe you're getting a new award. It's something you've never done before. You've never written a proposal or an application for this type of award before. You may have to hire a grant writer. There's an invisible cost that you may not have realized you're going to have to undertake to get to actually even apply for this grant. And then if your folks themselves are doing proposals and bids and your own staff, think about the time and the cost it takes just to do those. Those folks of you out there who actually do proposals, you do the pre-award work, the time and energy and effort and the cost it takes to actually do those bids and proposals and applications, and it can be costly. So you definitely want to make sure that you are budgeting and looking at, can your organization actually afford to even submit your application for this? Pre-award preparation and adequate policies and procedures. Again, maybe you're new to grants, you've never had a grant, maybe you have no policies and procedures. You want to do these in advance. You want to make sure as you write them that you realize exactly what you have to have in place, procurement policies, conflicts of interest, and things like that. Then one of the big ones, pre-award internal control testing and gap mediation costs. You have got to test your internal controls and make sure you can actually meet the requirements of the grant. Can you do that? Are your internal controls sufficient for this grant? Do you have to modify them? Do you have to rewrite them? Do you have to add to them? And how do we fix these gaps? And what is it going to cost to fix those gaps? Staff capacity analysis and potential increase in FTE. Can your current staff handle the extra workload? Is it going to cost you to bring in more staff? Are you going to have to hire more people to come in and actually handle an extra workload? And then onboarding, transitioning, and training costs. Same kind of thing. It takes time and money to get a new employee trained, and it takes time and money to get an existing employee trained that's learning something new. So when you're thinking about your pre-award readiness, make sure you review and budget for these type of costs. Next slide. We have a poll question. All right. What is your primary purpose for attending today's webinar? We'll give you about 1 minute. And remember, you have to answer 3 of the 4 polling questions in order to receive your CPE today. Okay, I'm going to wrap that up. So let's look at how our answers came in. Most people have federal funding and want to learn more about it. That's awesome. A lot of people just need that CPE. Oh, wow. Well, hopefully you learned some really cool stuff today. All right, next slide, please. So now we'll talk about those invisible hidden costs that are post-award that we may see when we get a grant. So these are costs that are actually incurred during the performance period of the award. And I'm going to go through these a little bit quicker so we don't run out of time. But we have administrative costs. That's a big one. When you're looking at direct costs, you're looking at your salaries, like I said, of the people directly working, but you also have the people working behind the scenes. You have your grants accountants, you have your people that are managing the budget, you have folks that are working up your documents, programming, who is going to analyze your outcomes, and how are they going to do that? Are they going to do it with a spreadsheet, and it's going to take a long time and it's manual, or does it just take a little bit of time because you have a software program? Figure out what percentage of the funding this is going to cost you. This is another big one, staff time of processing grant generated invoices. You need to make sure that you plan, if you have a cost reimbursement grant, you're planning for the timing and the lag between when you actually make the payment to an invoice and when you actually get reimbursed. Can your organization sustain when you're waiting for that actual reimbursement? Because you have to carry the cost. So can you actually sustain if you're paying a $500,000 invoice and you're a small organization? Definitely look at that. Expansion of buildings, workplace IT and software licenses. Sometimes you get into a grant and you're adding a big grant where you have 10 people you're bringing on board. You're definitely going to have to look at expansion of buildings, adding offices, maybe adding a building, adding workspace, adding desks, things like that. There's a possible hidden cost right there for you. So real quick, there's management of program income, and then time and effort on subrecipient management and time and effort on grant reporting, which kind of go together. Time and effort, that takes a lot of time when you're subrecipient monitoring, right? You've got to do the risk assessment to start out. Someone has to do that. Someone has to do the monitoring. Someone has to do the desk reviews and the on-site reviews, correct? And then at the same time, reporting, you have a new cycle of reports every quarter, every year. Who's going to do this? How often and how much will it cost you to actually do that? Next slide. So a few other invisible costs are things like technology. Do you have the grant management software? Do you have the technology to track these grants and to be able to provide accurate reporting for the grant that you're actually receiving? That answer may be no. So you definitely need to look at, do we need to add any more technology? Do we need a grants management program? Can we actually have effective internal controls if we do not have some kind of management technology software? Other things that come into play are intellectual property, especially if you have like a research grant, additional cybersecurity costs. Some grants up front tell you, we are expecting you to have this type of security. Do you have that? Are you going to have to implement that? Maybe you get into the grant and you're working with a grant with PII or PHI or something like that. And there's another cost where you're like, oh, we are not secure enough. Well, that's another hidden cost that you would have wished you would have budgeted for. When we all know if we spend over $750,000 in federal funding, we're going to have to pay for that audit. And you also want to look at your NICRA application and your negotiation costs and wrap those into any fees hidden fees or fees that you'll be paying towards your grant to keep those requirements up. Next slide. Polling question 2. Do you have a cost management function in your agency? Give you about a minute. Okay, let's go ahead and wrap that up, please. Yes, that's awesome. So 52% of you say yes, 25% don't know, and 23% said no. So that's something you want to look at with your organization to have some cost management functions to help you understand and make sure you're cost effective. Next slide, please. So what do we want to do to make sure that we're finding these invisible costs and making sure that we know at the beginning of the grant what we're actually getting into? You want to analyze as much as you can every possible cost that you think could occur with that grant. And one good thing you guys could actually do is you could use these slides and kind of turn them into a checklist. And you could go through these possible costs and check them off, and then you know that you've looked at them. but you want to make sure you want to get your budget as close as you can. You want to analyze, you want to make sure that you're not going to, that your organization will not be hurt financially or any other way by going into any kind of grant where you're going to have a lot of hidden fees. So typical challenges, real quick, these are associated with all the things we just talked about. So I'm just going to go through these really fast. Challenges of the cost of grants: experience. A lot of people are inexperienced. They don't know what to look for. They're unfamiliar with the grant. It's going to take some time to learn that grant, and time, as we were talking about. Tools. Do you have the tools to actually track and be compliant with this grant as the requirements of the grant say it must be? Absence of processes. Do you have processes, work processes? Do your processes need some work? Do you have internal controls? Do you have your documentation, your policies and procedures in place? That needs to take place. Staffing. Are you limited in skill-wise or people-wise? Can you adequately do the grant administration and oversight? And when you're looking at staffing, you got to look at separation of duties, because that's important as well. And knowledge. It's a new grantee. How much time is it going to take us to learn how to do this? All of these are time consuming, and they could be costly. Next slide. So free money comes with a cost. It's not actually free. Is anything actually free? So now you know what to look for to ensure that you can actually sustain your grant. So now, how do you mitigate this? How do we mitigate these costs, and how do we ensure that we're recovering as much as possible from the grants that we receive? So I'm going to turn this over to Nikki, and she's going to continue with indirect costs and cost recovery.
Thanks, Kat. Appreciate it.
Welcome.
So moving on, one of the things first to tie in the expense of the grant is, I've worked over the course of my career doing only indirect costs, nothing but, for the last almost 23 years now. And so I've seen a lot of different situations happen, and the idea of making sure that your organization can be sustainable during the process of receiving these grants and understanding the full cost of them. We like to focus on just the work at hand, if you will, the things that are actually in front of us that we can see, that we can look at and really understand. So it is so important to not only look at those pre-award, post-award costs, but then also the indirect cost component. So what I want to talk about here is indirect cost and kind of how we look at it, or how people try to avoid it. I find that very common in most organizations. They're just not wanting to understand because it's kind of over there in the corner. So they want to make sure that they don't want to make sure, they want to try to avoid it. So indirect costs, we talk about cost allocation plans, or you might have heard about cost allocation plans or indirect cost rates, or the NICRA. A lot of people talk about them synonymously. So I want to go into a little bit of the differences, because I think it's important to understand both, and that you have both within your organization. So a cost allocation plan gives you that annual amount. It's that 30,000-foot view of your organization. It's probably the one document in your organization that actually will show you what is it costing you to provide all of your services, regardless of the funding source. So in this case, it's not just looking at grants, it's looking at absolutely everything you do in your organization and saying, what is it costing us to support them? We look at our central support departments, or the HR, finance, all of those ones that are supporting the entire organization. So this is your agency-wide indirect cost. And then further down, what we do from there is, once we've determined how much it's costing for all of your different programs and services you're performing, we now come to creating that indirect cost rate. And that indirect cost rate will now be able to use on those grants to say, how much is it costing us per dollar to support the grants that we're working on? There's going to be varying degrees, but this is more, you're able to add the departmental indirect cost to this, and then you also bring in the cost plan agency-wide. And why this is important is for sustainability. You need to understand what it's really costing you to perform your services, making strategic decisions on how to move forward. It is so important that we're informed. Now, the most important part about that is you can be informed and still make the same decision. You still are going to go after that grant, but you go in knowing what you're subsidizing, knowing how you're going to cover that subsidy, and you have better information. So that is really important to then moving down to making sure you're making the biggest impact. So to achieve maximum reimbursement, it's knowing where you are going to cover the costs, and then how do you make the biggest impact on these programs. It is when you take on a grant, they are expecting you to perform on this grant with the expectations of the grant. So are you going to be able to subsidize these costs? And knowing that going in, you can be a much better steward of your money. Okay, polling question real quick. When's the last time you calculated an indirect cost rate? About a minute.
And Nikki, while they're answering that question, there was a question that came into the chat. Any idea how long it takes to get an approved rate after applying for one?
That's a great question. So depending on what your cognizant agency is, and cognizant agency means the largest funding source that you receive, that is deemed your cognizant. And so depending on the resources available, so for example, HHS has a team of people that do the indirect cost rates. They are kind of backlogged now, so they say to expect anywhere between 3 to 6 months for that first rate to get approved. Really all it is getting it in the queue. But other than that, it's not, it takes that long just to get it recognized. Other agencies sometimes struggle because they don't have the resources, so they have to contract out. So it could take a little longer. I would say on average, it's about 3 months. And all right. We have the results. Okay, well, that's great. 40% last year, last 5 years, and then never. Pretty even across the board. Well, that's really good to know, because I think it's really important that by the end of this, everyone's going to want to have a negotiated rate, and you're going to know why it's so important for your organization. Okay, so now this slide, if you take nothing else from our presentation, this is what I really want you guys to sink in and really think about, because I think that over time, we look at things in buckets. You know, it's normal for us to say, here's our direct cost, here's our indirect cost. And basically by doing that, we're acting like you might not need one. And so indirect costs only exist to support the cost of the direct services. That's the only reason they're there. And direct costs cannot exist without indirect costs. So really, we need to be looking at the true cost, because one is not optional. Just because we don't calculate it, just because we don't, look at it, doesn't mean it's not there. So one can't happen without the other. And so it's really important that we leave here understanding, regardless of how we're going to cover it, how we're going to do this, it has to be looked at and it has to be understood. What is our full cost of service? If you're a governmental agency, you have your budget, and that's free to the public, to see. We, put those online and we let people, we have transparency and we want to show what our costs are. But if you think about a pie chart of all of your costs, the general fund is the largest portion, most cases. It usually makes up anywhere from 40 to 55, somewhere around % of your overall costs. Now, when we show a budget, you're not showing that those costs are actually supporting the rest of the pie. You're just showing that The general fund is here, which all the administrative departments sit there. But then also we have our public safety, we have our parks and rec. We have those services that us as taxpayers are expecting the money to go to. So we expect that when we pay our taxes, this is what we're going to get for it. We're going to get more cops on the street. We're going to have better resources to service the constituents. If we don't look at our indirect costs to the place they're actually being incurred, then we're not really representing that in the budget. We're not representing what is really happening. And that puts you at risk for taking dollars away from your public safety and all that. Because if you don't get them recovered by the grants, which are things that you're going after, that you want to do within your organization, you want to perform these services. But if you don't look at the indirect cost of what it's costing you, you're basically taking that away from the taxpayers and the public safety and that, because it's a zero-sum game. Just because we don't recognize it does not mean that you're not using it and it's costing you to do that. So hidden costs, as we talked earlier in the day or in the presentation, it wasn't that long ago, but hidden costs are those ones that you can't readily identify. So when we look at something and we're looking at a program, you don't necessarily know what support is being used to support that program. And there's varying degrees. So within a cost allocation plan, what we're doing is we're functionalizing that cost and spreading it out on allocation metrics that's representative of those services. So it helps to identify these costs and make them so they're not hidden anymore, and you now know what they cost. This is typically subsidized by the organization because it's not identified. And so when we do indirect cost rates, I would say on average, they're 30 to 40%. Now, that might shock some of you guys. A lot of people tend to think that, oh, our administrative costs is 10% or somewhere around there. But when you start to really look at all the services that are used to support every last thing, we have, IT, everyone needs a computer. We have facilities maintenance, wherever we sit, there's maintenance costs associated with that. We have attorneys. We have to be able to look at contracts and do all of those things. We have, most importantly, payroll. Everyone wants their paycheck. Those are all things that cost money, and the percentage of what you're subsidizing can grow through that process without identifying it. So direct versus indirect, I usually don't have to go into too many things about direct. Most people understand we can trace it to the program, we can trace it to what we're doing. Indirect cost is where it gets a little trickier. Now, one of the things I think that's hard about indirect costs is there's no one definition. Everyone kind of calls it something different. Administrative costs, overhead costs, indirect costs. So the way I like to kind of talk about it so we can identify what costs we're looking at is indirect cost is really that umbrella. We're looking at the umbrella of all costs that are administrative in nature, and that usually includes your agency-wide. And so the agency-wide is supporting everything underneath the umbrella. It's saying our HR, our payroll, it services all programs and services regardless of the funding source. So that's that indirect cost. Then we take it one step down to our overhead or administrative costs, and this is really more departmental. So when we look at, let's say, police administration, that's only supporting the police overall departments and funds. It's not supporting anything outside of that. So this is our departmental level. We're looking at overhead, kind of means over the head, just right above it is like those supervisors. So within our grants, we have the supervisors that are overseeing a handful of grants, not just one. So that's an administrative expense. So it's really important. So I want to give an example of the importance of indirect costs and knowing this going in. So years ago, there was a big push for body cams. The public wanted it for transparency. The police wanted it to support themselves, to make sure like people knew they were doing things and they couldn't say that they weren't doing something right or anything like that. So it was kind of on both sides, people were really interested in it. So there were a whole bunch of grants that came out during that time that was for the equipment of the body cams. And so, you know, we'll pay up for all the body cams and there's our equipment and you get this grant and you can put all these up there. So the police departments would apply for this grant and they'd get it. And the expectation now is that you're going to put them in play. You got this grant, you got this money, now buy that equipment and put them in play. What was happening across the board is organizations were really struggling with this process because it wasn't thought through what it was really going to cost you to put them up and running and keep them up and running. So what I mean by that is, okay, we have our direct cost. We have what it's costing the camera, you know, for the camera equipment, we have all of that. Well, now think about the fact that we have to log every police officer as they come in. They have to download their videos. They have to do all of the things related to cataloging all of the information. So we're talking, you know, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, however many officers, all of these things were having to be organized. And then the IT storage was astronomical. So the storage costs of storing all of these videos, they have to keep it on there for 7 years. So that's astronomical. So the IT costs and the support of cataloging and doing all that, astronomical. Then we go to the next step. It increased the public records requests. So now public records was having an influx of having to go find these videos and the cataloging to be able to produce that for the person who requested it. And then we also don't think about the fact that they have to blur out the faces of everyone else in the video except for the person who requested it. So that is another step that you have to go through, watch the video, blur out, do all of those things. Then that created more lawsuits. So now the attorneys are busier. And now we're doing all of these things that weren't really an issue before at the degree of which it was done. So the list goes on, and we did some studies at what it was really costing. And so, for example, you get a $500,000 grant to buy equipment. It was costing them $3.5 million to support it, all indirect costs. Now, so that's when we're talking about what is it costing you to get this money. For them, it costs $3.5 million to get 500,000. So when you think about that, now this is a drastic example. I know it's drastic, but it's really to get the point, to drive the point home, because that, if you think about that, if we knew that going in, now it doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to still go forward with it, but what it does is it changes the game. If you know it's going to cost you an additional $3.4 million to support this, you have time to say, okay, how are we going to cover this? Rather than it being a deficit in the general fund, do we take it to the public? Do we say, put it on the ballot and say, do you guys want this? Do we want to raise our sales tax to make sure that we can cover this cost? Do we want to, you know, cover a portion of the costs, and then put it out to the public to cover the rest? So these are all things that you can talk about if you know what it's costing you, but not if you don't. So knowing this going in is critical for all of the elements of taking on this grant. So we kind of went through the cost allocation plan and that 30,000 foot view, and you know, really understanding what it's costing for every program, regardless of the services being performed. You will hear different kinds of cost plans. There's a full cost plan and a 2 CFR Part 200. The 2 CFR Part 200 just means that it's following the uniform guidance for the accepted, you know, indirect cost process. And that's what you use for federal and state grants. So this is how you go through it and you get a NICRA. And that NICRA will then be able to, it means you're in compliance with the guidelines, you've excluded costs that are necessary to exclude, and you've calculated correctly. Now, a full cost allocation plan, we follow the same process. It's the same methodology. It's the same allocation basis, that type of thing. But what it does is it's less conservative. So in certain cases, like we can't allocate out general government costs in the 2 CFR, but in the full cost plan you can, and it really is a cost. And so when you're an organization thinking about doing these services, it's important that you do both, because when it comes to the full cost plan and you're charging out the public for services, let's say developers to get planning fee, plan check fees and all of those things, you want to charge them the full cost. But then when you're getting the grant, we want to look at what is our 2 CFR plan. So as I mentioned, I just said this right now. So the uses of the cost plan can be used on both sides, charging the public, user fee services. It's also used for utilities. So you allocate out the cost to the utility, they build that into the fees, the rates for the utilities, and making sure that they're capturing those costs. Again, all of these factors, by doing them, is making sure that you're not taking the dollars away from the things that we're paying taxes for. Indirect cost rate proposal is that we come up with the indirect cost pool, and that's related to the agency-wide indirect and any departmental indirect, supervisors, all of those things that it costs to support internally in the department level. That's your pool. So that's your numerator. Your denominator can be a couple of different things. You can do total program costs. So that means on every dollar that you are charging out, you charge a percentage related to the indirect cost, or you can do it on just salaries and benefits. I typically go with the program costs. One, because of perception, people looking at the rate's lower because the denominator is bigger. But then also it allows you to really look at all of the costs that you are incurring, and not just, you might have a program that has a lot of costs, but not a lot of staff. So maybe you have to hire some consultants to do things or that kind of thing. That wouldn't be factored into that grant, even though you are supporting it. I always get ahead of myself. This was what I was just talking about, and the numerator and the denominator. So anyways, the overhead costs are really that, accumulated total. It's typically on an annual basis. And that's how we look at things. Again, it's not in the uniform guidance. It doesn't dictate a specific denominator that you have to use. It says salaries and benefits, or program costs, or just salaries. The only thing you have to keep in mind is it's critical that when you're applying it, that you know what the base was, so you apply it correctly. So now getting into indirect cost recovery. So how do we leverage our indirect cost rate to capture more? So a lot of people don't like to talk about indirect cost rate because they say, we want all our money to go to the program. We don't want to take any away. And that's how we like to spin it, if you will, or how the departments that are working on the program directly don't want you to take any of their money away because they want to do their services. So again, we're not taking it away because it really is the cost. And so usually I get people to understand that by simply saying, do you want your paycheck? And the answer is always yes. And so there's a cost associated with that. So we say, this isn't taking anything away from you. This really is what it's costing for this program. Now, this is a couple years old, obviously, because we are way more in spending for federal grants because of ARPA funding and all the COVID funding that was out there. So, but this is just an example that I wanted to show you is of all of the funds that we are looking at, what you can see is that in this particular example of $749 billion, over $150 billion was not spent. And we can leverage our indirect cost rate to capture that. And what I mean by that is pretty much every single organization, if you receive a decent amount of grants, now, if you're a nonprofit and you receive like 1 or 2 grants, this is not going to be you, but everybody else, if they are doing a whole portfolio of grants, you're not going to fully draw down on all your awards. whatever the reason, resources, timing, whatever it might be, you might not be able to draw down fully on that award. So if we look at the indirect cost, can you capture more? So if there's dollars left on the award, we can go back 2 years and apply the indirect cost rate to those dollars and capture the unspent portion of dollars. Now, if your indirect cost is higher than the unspent amount, you can only capture the unspent amount, but you can capture up to the award. So this is a process that we go through. We go back 2 years, and all of these dollars that come in are now unrestricted in the general fund to do as you please. Buy more systems. Maybe you need a grant management system. You need all of these things. This is completely unrestricted. And the reason is because you've already subsidized it in prior year. So you already spent those dollars, even though you didn't get reimbursement for them. So it's a way of capturing those dollars and getting budgeted revenue into your general fund to do as you please. And that's really important for these organizations. And right now, with the ARPA funding, sometimes people aren't thinking about all that because they're like, oh, we have all this money to do all these programs. That's going to go away. So how do we make sure that we are being great stewards of our money? So for example, with an indirect cost rate, let's say you have a 37.5% indirect cost rate, and your grant has a cap of 10% and a 25% match component. If you negotiate an indirect cost rate, you can now use that as your match. So you no longer have to set cash aside. You use this as your match. And so you can still do that. So if your rate's 37.5 and you have a 25% match, your entire match will be covered by that indirect cost rate. This is allowing agencies to go after more grants that have the match component, because before they didn't have the cash to set aside. Now you don't even need the cash to set aside. You have your indirect cost rate. And this is the federal government's acknowledgement that we really do. Indirect cost really is important and is part of the cost of the service. Okay, indirect costs and fiscal recovery funds. If you have a negotiated rate, then that's great. And then, you know, you're already steps ahead and we can start doing that. But then also, how do you obtain one? So we're obtaining them. You would submit to a cognizant agency to do that. Now, one of the things I think is extremely important to say is the cognizant agencies or the auditors or the negotiators that you're working with don't always know all the rules. And so, I mean, I have done federal trainings for cognizant agencies across the board to help their negotiators really look at the guidelines properly and understand it, because that's it. So be your own advocate. Don't just take it at face value with what they're saying if they come back at you. One of the things where that's coming back at you is if you do not have $35 million in direct federal funding, if you're a local government or tribal government, or $10 million as a nonprofit, then your negotiated agreement looks like this. You produce it, or you calculate your indirect cost rate. You put all supplemental information like your org chart, your ACFR, single audit if you have one, all of those into a packet and a submission. And you exclude the costs that you are, and this is where I would probably recommend a consultant to do it for this purpose if you fall underneath that, which a lot of people do. I have very large organizations where they're receiving $500 million, but they don't have it in direct federal. It comes from the state mostly, and then their federal, let's say, is only 30 million direct. So that this would be applicable to them. So with that, you don't have to negotiate it. So what that means is that you produce the packet. That's now deemed your negotiated indirect cost rate, even though you don't have approval, technically speaking. And when you submit that to the grantor, they're going to come back and say it has to be negotiated. And then you talk to us, and I have a letter from the White House because I work with the White House on the 2 CFR guidelines, but I have a letter that states you cannot deny this indirect cost rate. You either accept it at this value, or you have to negotiate it, you, the grantor. So no longer with the cognizant, it's the grantor's responsibility, and they cannot force you to do the de minimis. How are we on time?
We're getting close, Nikki. And I actually, with you talking about the negotiation of the rate, we've had a couple questions come through related to organizations that are subrecipients. So when an organization is a subrecipient, to whom does the organization go to for requesting the NICRA?
That's a great question. So the idea behind it is you have to look at your entire portfolio. So whoever your largest funding source is deemed your cognizant. Now, if your largest funding source is as a subrecipient, like let's say the state, it becomes the pass-through's responsibility to negotiate the rate. That's also in the guidelines. So if it's not a like HHS at the federal level and it's the state of California Health and Human Services Department, it becomes their responsibility to negotiate a rate, and they have to do that so that you have the ability to have this rate.
And what if they use just the de minimis rate? Then does the subrecipient default to the de minimis rate as well?
No, if you have a negotiated rate, they must accept it. So that's the idea behind, and why you want to go through that process is it must be accepted. It doesn't matter if the funder has they just use the de minimis. The idea is your NOFA becomes your friend. So whatever the contract that you received or the NOFA you received for the grant, if it does not specifically state that you cannot use your NICRA at a certain rate, or we have a cap on our admin, then the NICRA must be accepted. Any other questions? I think this is our last polling question.
And Nikki, while they're answering this question, a couple more questions that came through in the Q&A.
Okay.
If you receive federal funding from Department of DOE and USAID, and the current cognizant is USAID, yet funding for DOE becomes a more substantial funding source, will the cognizant change? And if so, how does that work?
Great question. That's a very good question. So the cognizant will change when that particular funding source that's gotten bigger now than your cognizant has been like that for 5 years. So if you don't have, if let's say it goes up for 2 years and then it comes back down, you reset. So you have to have a consistent funder that is more than your cognizant for 5 years for it to actually change. And also with ARPA funding, that all gets excluded from the cognizant area. So if you receive, in the next couple of years, more money from ARPA than any other, it doesn't matter. You're not going to have the treasury as your cognizant ever. So keep that in mind, but it's 5 years.
Okay, thank you. And then one more kind of back to talking about calculating direct versus indirect costs through the cost allocation plan. Looking for a better understanding of including international hires in the direct salary base for calculating overhead rates. So since their salaries don't flow through the home office payroll system, they use an international payroll provider. Can you speak to that?
So if your payroll costs are a contract somewhere and it's not internal, then you would be doing, it would be a line item expense, and you just calculate that to or we just put that to your indirect cost pool. So as long as you know what the expense is, it doesn't matter if it's not internal staffing, it's still payroll costs that's allowable as indirect. So
Thank you.
I will go through this really quickly and allow for more questions. I just want one of the things is perception. So I understand that everyone receives pushback on this idea of indirect costs. So it's really how we talk about it. It's how we talk to our organization, and the people who are receiving the grant funding, the departments, need to understand the impact. If we don't collect it from this program, we're taking it away from our taxpayers. It's very important to understand. So then as an organization, you can make an informed decision of how you want to operate. You can decide to subsidize some of it. You can decide to subsidize all of it, but where available, you should get it from the federal government. And so if you haven't done that, one of the good ways to get through that process with the departments that are really holding on to their money tightly, and really are pushing back on this indirect idea, is that cost recovery. Go back 2 years and be able to capture those dollars that were unspent, because you can no longer spend them directly. You can't go back 2 years and say, oh, wait, I want to charge more to that. You can't do it with the direct. But the indirect, the idea is, the reason why we can go back is because of the fact that the cost was already incurred in that given period. You just didn't collect it. Negotiated indirect cost rates. The great part about it is, I always say, negotiate it really as it is. Don't try to lower it because you're worried that people are going to say it's too much, because you get to use, it's a policy decision. You don't have to be consistent across the board. One grant, you can use the full negotiated rate. The next grant, you can use 25%, and the rate is 37%. You can do that because of the fact you can charge anything less than, and it does not have to be consistent across the board. So you can just not charge more than the negotiated rate. Why is indirect cost important? Cost recovery, understanding, improved financial management. If you apply for a grant and you understand your indirect cost and you're identifying it, you're actually a better candidate for that funding and winning that award, because they know that even if you can't collect it all, that you know what it's going to cost you, which means that you've made a conscious decision to still go after it, even if you're not going to capture all your dollars. And that is important to them, because the grantor has to do the risk assessments. They want to make sure that you're going to actually be able to perform on that grant. All right. Thanks so much. And let's answer questions. Any other questions?
Okay. If the grant disallows indirect, but we have a NICRA, can we still use the unrecovered as match?
Yes, afterwards. So if you have indirect cost as match, oh, I get what you're saying. Can you still use it as match? Yes, absolutely. So indirect cost on the grant dollars themselves, if they exclude it and it's specific in the NOFA that's the case, you absolutely can use it as match, because that's the federal side identifying what match component is. So a match is allowable to be indirect, and that does not affect what they're saying about the indirect on the direct funds that you're spending.
Okay. And then one kind of related to that, we've been told that we have to apply our full NICRA per CFR 200. Where does it state anything up to?
I can get back to you on that and where it does, but you do not. The idea is that if you're choosing to subsidize, which means if you don't collect your full NICRA, you're subsidizing. So that's the reason why you don't have to charge up to. You can say, this is our NICRA, we're going to use it in these cases, but we're going to use less here. That means you're subsidizing it. So they can't tell you you can't do that, because you're allowed to subsidize the funds if you want to, because it's not affecting them.
Okay.
But I can follow up, and if someone wants to leave an email, we can follow up, and I can get the backup to that information.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Can you go back 2 years to recover indirect cost if you do not have a NICRA?
You have to get a NICRA, but you can get a NICRA for 2 years back. If you're applying for a NICRA, and I've submitted 3 years before when I'm doing it for an agency that hasn't ever done one. I go back and I get 3 years approved. And so then you can have it, but you have to have an actual NICRA to be able to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
And if our last NICRA was less than 10%, are we able to elect de minimis? And does it have to be approved by the cognizant?
If you've negotiated an indirect cost rate, you can no longer use de minimis. I would find it really hard to imagine that there is a below 10% rate. So I would revisit that rate and see, what costs might be being left out of the indirect cost pool. But if you've negotiated a rate and it's actually been approved, you can no longer use the de minimis. It's not an option under the guidelines.
Okay. I'm going to squeeze in one last one here because it's a good one. How can the indirect be match when the federal grant has a 15% cap on admin expenses?
That's a great question. So if you're separating out match from the direct funds that the federal government is paying for, they're different things. So the idea is the federal or the grant is saying we're only going to allow you 15% on those direct funds. So if you've been awarded $1 million, they're saying you can only do $150,000 in admin and collect that. However, that means you're subsidizing the rest of it. And so that subsidy is now being used as your match component because you can subsidize, you can match, it's cash. And, that's the same idea as if you're using your indirect or your cash. You're giving it to support the grant. So that's why you're allowed to do that. And that is specifically stated. And I believe it's 200.306C, I think, that relates to the match component, but they're separate things. So the $1 million award only allows for 150,000, but your match is a separate item that comes with it. And they cannot dictate that you can't use your NICRA for your match. It's not an option. It's allowable. And so they have to accept it. Okay, I know we're out of time. Sorry, I could talk about this for a lifetime. So, thank you, everyone. I don't know, Maddie, do we have any closing remarks or anything, or Kat?
Yeah, if you want to put up the last slide, it has our email addresses on there. So thank you all for joining us. This can be a complex topic. We appreciate you joining us to learn more about it. If you have questions, you can reach out to Nikki or I on any of the topics we discussed today. So thank you very much. Have a great day. And also there will be a short survey after this. We'd greatly appreciate it if you guys would take that. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for your time today.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Please email us. I'm happy to answer any questions. We didn't get to it today.